Hey, I'm Tash and I'm leading up marketing at Cosive.
Hi, I'm Prescott Pym, a principal consultant at Cosive. I've been with Cosive since November last year and really just love helping organizations shape their SOC and CTI programs.
Prescott, today we're going to talk about threat sharing communities. So to start with, some people may know what they are, what that means. Some people listening to this may not. Can you give us a little summary of what a threat sharing community is?
So a threat sharing community is really a group of like-minded people who come together and want to form a sense of community around what sort of threats they're seeing out in the wild. So they collaborate together, share the information, trying to get a bit of that herd immunity and complement each other's programs to make sure that all their assets are secure and they're mitigating the risks as much as they can. Threat sharing communities are interesting. I think there's been a journey across time with threat sharing where it used to be a bit more backroom and only people in the know would share information because there's a lot of reticence around sharing information about potential breaches within an organization. But across particularly the last 5 years or so, I think a lot more organizations are getting on board with the utility around sharing threat information. That's been more recently uplifted with the Cybersecurity Act from last year, where ASD and Home Affairs sort of worked together to put in some provisions around reporting of incidents and non-retaliation from agencies to prosecute where threat information is shared. So I think there's a bit of a groundswell of organizations becoming more comfortable at sharing. There's certainly conversations that happen up to the CISO level in organizations where previously it was really only the technical folk who sort of would get together and have those sort of conversations. Threat sharing communities come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be very, very informal networks, just through instant messaging, Signal, things like that, where people, practitioners typically, are just sharing, hey, I've seen this in my network. How about you? There's some more broader scale general threat sharing communities using things like Slack, and we're certainly involved in a number of those with Cosive, where we have like-minded peers both within Australia and internationally, sharing observations and sometimes even really structured data around what sort of threats exist. And then broader, bigger threat sharing communities like from the Australian Signals Directorate Cyber Threat Intelligence Sharing Program, where you can actually subscribe to these sorts of feeds, download content, use those in your system, and then also share that information back that might be relevant to other members of the community. So yeah, they can scale all the way from just one-to-one peer conversations to national programs of significance.
One thing that I find really interesting about threat sharing communities is that they often include people from organizations that in the market are fierce competitors, might be, for example, two major banks in the same threat sharing community. Can you talk a little bit about why organizations often have this kind of willingness to collaborate on threat sharing, even though they compete in just about every other area?
Yeah, great point, Tash. And this is why I'm particularly passionate about this area of cyber, is I'm very community driven and have done a lot of work in the community over the last 20 years, both inside and outside of cyber. And I think it's just an area where we've identified that if we don't coordinate ourselves across industry and across Australia, then we're less likely to be able to mitigate the sorts of threats that are out there. And everyone sees a little piece of the telemetry on their own, but only by combining those pieces and sharing and talking about it can we actually really uncover a lot of the threats, the infrastructure, the techniques and procedures that the actor groups will use to attack those organizations. And I think that over time organizations are more willing to work together and not compete on cyber, and particularly the threat sharing aspect. Some of that goes back to the informal groups. We see some of the larger industry segments freely sharing that sort of information, like you mentioned. Also, part of that is probably within the ecosystem, a lot of people move around between different organizations. So they may have worked at one and then another. So they've got some really good linkages and there's a really strong sense of professionalism amongst those players. So I think it sort of comes naturally to the subject matter that people are willing to be sharing, but a lot of that comes down to trust. That's particularly big for CTI. Is when you're a part of a trusted group, you need to be able to rely on the information sources that the others are bringing along to that particular sharing group. If you break the trust, you can get yourself out of the circle, but I think that everyone does a really great job of working towards the greater good. in this sense. So those sort of systems work, and people are vetted. It's a known source who you're talking to, so that makes it easier to share that information.
One question people may have listening to this is, if I wanted to get involved in a threat sharing community, or I wanted my organization to get involved, it has to start with, a trusted group of peers. How do people typically find out about and get involved with threat sharing communities?
Yeah, that's probably a tough one because there's no real central repository of, hey, I want to join a threat sharing community. Here's everything on offer, because some of those are closed source. Sometimes, we've got a wide variety of different types of people, but some people aren't really willing to share that much. Others are quite open. So yeah, it's kind of who you know in some ways. So if you're looking to get into those sort of sharing groups, probably the best way is to approach people in your network. And this comes back to the power of, as a professional, making sure that you're building the right contacts in your industry vertical, and asking those questions. And then once you sort of, someone can sponsor you into some of those groups to vet that, you're a known entity and you're trustworthy. So a lot of that happens by word of mouth, but you've got to be able to demonstrate that, you're doing it for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. Yeah, cyber espionage is a big play here. Threat actors would love to know, what the defenders are looking at. So got to make sure that the people who are in these groups are able to be trusted.
Let's say that you have an opportunity to join in with a threat sharing community. What sort of maturity do you need to have as an organization to participate in some of these groups?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people want to be included in these types of networks, but probably don't have a lot of capability. And there's other groups who might have really high maturity levels in what they do, but really aren't interested in joining those sorts of groups either, because they just want to do their own thing. So yeah, there's a large maturity curve on cyber threat intel sharing. There's not really many formal ways of measuring that. ASD have put a little bit of work into the cyber threat sharing maturity model, which they published through their partner portal. Also, the beginnings of that are in the Cyber Threat Intel Capability Maturity Model, CTIS, as we call it, which is a new international maturity scale for how organizations are effective in running their CTI programs. So at Cosive, we're certainly hooked into that, looking to provide some advice to clients around where their threat intel programs are and what the maturity levels are. But coming back to your question, anyone can really get involved in this sort of stuff. The lower maturity organizations are really probably at the the reactive stage, where there's been a breach. Oh my God, we run that particular software stack. Let's get the indicators and see if we're impacted, so we can start remediating. And then you've got organizations that sort of probably have a medium maturity level, where they're doing all these integrations with their SIEM tools and able to both do a little bit of reactive and proactive CTI work, all the way up to the very large organizations who have strong programs around CTI. There's automation, orchestration in place across their environments. And I heard of one organization that when they get a threat intel indicator in, they can have their entire environment searched over within about 10 to 15 seconds to see where there's particular matches. But that requires a lot of effort to be able to implement and maintain those systems as well. So there's a wide variety of maturity levels. I guess my advice, if you're starting out on those sort of programs, is to really look at what are your objectives for threat intel and start shaping that up before you dive too much into developing the technical components of a CTI program. But also at the other end of the scale, if you're doing that sort of integration and automation, you can still benefit greatly, not just by consuming that information, but sharing it to other organizations to help protect the wider community as well.
Is it fair to say that one of the biggest benefits of membership in a threat intel sharing community is the relevance of the threats that you're going to be able to access through those groups, compared to public feeds and things like that, which may be less relevant to your organization?
Yeah, definitely. So there can be a lot of noise out there with cyber threats. So some of that comes back to setting the right objectives within your organization, looking at what is the actual risk that you're trying to mitigate across the program. So it needs to be driven top down through your cyber programs. But part of that discovery work is really analyzing what are the threats that are going to impact what we're trying to protect in our environments. So it could be, for instance, that you've joined an industry vertical threat sharing group like an ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So they will send out some very specific, industry-based content, which might be highly relevant for you. So, if you're in critical infrastructure, there's an ISAC who will provide relevant information about the attacks in that particular industry vertical. There's a airline one, there's a financial one. So they can be really targeted threat sharing groups you can get involved in. But even down to the lower level, some of the smaller informal threat sharing groups that are out there. If you've got a mate who's, the CTI lead another program, they're probably going to give you some really interesting telemetry about what's happening in the environment. If you're part of a really huge, large-scale network like CTIS from ASD, the important part is really looking at all the content that they're pushing out, because there's billions of events potentially in those, and working out which are the ones that are going to be relevant for you in your organization.
Once you've joined and gotten set up in a threat intel sharing community, what does participating typically look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, participating in a threat sharing community, it can vary between the different types of groups. Some groups may be just a bit of a fire hose of here's all the information to send out, and we just want people to absorb it and do their best to work out what's going to be relevant for them. Other groups might have a more formal sort of quota system where you sort of watch to see, are you contributing back in and not just pulling information out, because sometimes those threat sharing communities only work if people are actually sharing information and there's some sort of content out there. It's really difficult to get organizations to share formally, and having been involved in the CTIS program for ASD for some time, we came across a number of different blockers, political, legal, technical, sometimes even just, there's a really passionate person at that particular organization who's really leading the charge, loves the ability to connect into networks and get that information. They may move on, and then a lot of that program is sort of lost because there's no internal champion to really drive that program forwards. So there's a whole bunch of factors that affect an organization's ability to share. But I think, as long as you're contributing something even small once a year into these sort of groups, you're doing your little bit for helping pull the community along. Organizations sometimes will struggle to think, well, what's relevant for me to send out to the community. But I think what's important is we've seen a significant impact that you think is not just, targeted to you, but could be targeted more broadly. It's better to share that information out with the potential that someone else could benefit from that. Not sharing is not going to help anyone in the long run. And part of that is also what indicators or techniques or tactics would you think about sharing into these groups? The less mature organizations are probably going to just be able to say, look, this IP address hit me, or this hash file name we found in our network. Whereas larger organizations with bigger CTO programs are going to be able to say, we've been tracking this threat actor, here's their techniques and their tactics, and this is what we've observed, and this is their likely behavior, and this is the confidence we have that it was this particular threat group. And that's really valuable strategic threat intel, but that's not necessarily consumable by everyone because they can't map that directly down to the tool sets if they don't have them. So there's a lot of complexity about what to share. I think if you are unsure, asking about the types and appropriate information to share within that community itself with some specific examples, and they can say, yep, this is what we are actually looking for, or no, can you go away, do a bit more research, add your context for what you see as the threat, and then bring it back. So being open and collaborative and communicative will really help solve that problem.
When it comes to getting started with threat sharing, the blockers are real, and you already touched on some of them. I mean, I think that traditionally organizations may be used to being quite secretive about threats targeting their organization for fear that it might reveal, private or sensitive information to the industry or to the public. What are some tips and suggestions for organizations that might be concerned about that aspect of threat sharing, or even struggling to get approval from other functions within the organization to take part in something like this?
That's a really tough one. Every organization is a bit different in its approach. There may be regulatory limitations to that organization wanting to share, despite the best interest of the technical team. So that can definitely cause some tension. But I think you've got to approach it from a multi-layered perspective. You've got to have the technical capability to run a threat intel program. Look, that could be something as simple as a spreadsheet that you're tracking this information in still in this day and age. It could be all the way up to a full threat intel platform or using something like NISP to track those indicators. It could be that you need to have those, operational level conversations with, security operations managers, why this is beneficial to invest in a program. Certainly at Cosive, we're seeing a lot more organizations investing time and effort into their CTI programs than we have in previous years. So, it seems to be a bit of a groundswell around organizations wanting to do that, but you've still got to go up the next level towards the CISO and through extension of that, the board, to be able to get funding and approval for CTI programs, because they're not necessarily cheap either. Linking it through the strategy throughout the organization, relating it back to risk management and how a threat-informed defense can work with CTI is really important. And that's why we like to help organizations with their threat intel programs uplift and have those sort of conversations.
Let's talk about CTIS, which you mentioned in passing earlier. For those that don't know, what is CTIS and what kind of organizations can benefit from getting involved with CTIS?
The Cyber Threat Intel Sharing Program is something that's run by the Australian Signals Directorate. We got involved around 4 years ago as Deloitte and Cosive, which is where I spent a bit of time helping run the program. And we successfully work with around 400 plus organizations across Australia to integrate with the ASD's Cyber Threat Intel Sharing Program. That was a terrific initiative from ASD to really start sharing out a lot of telemetry to industry. And we're able to, have conversations with small, medium business, service providers, large organizations, international organizations about how they can consume cyber threat intel in Australia, and also how to contribute and share back in a bi-directional fashion as well. Something that really worked with that program was being able to output threat intel in a variety of different methodologies. So using MISP as an example, we're able to share out ASD threat intel in the MISP format, and conversely, there's also the Sticks Taxi format, which is also a very popular way of consuming threat intel and is built into a lot of the security tools that you might use every day, like SIEMs, SOAR, XDRs, all those sorts of things. So you can download the threat intel straight into those technologies and start using it straight away. We do a lot with Sticks Taxi and MISP at Cosive through the international standards organizations. So we've got some great ability to help organizations consume threat intel from these sorts of programs. But it was an interesting program to work on, and certainly we got a lot of attention from the international community around the work we were doing here in Australia, to be able to not only run this sort of program, but to get that real engagement across the entire economy and motivate organizations to sign up to a national program like this.
Some of the other threat sharing communities you described sound more informal, Slack groups, Signal groups, things like that. But CTIS is actually offering feeds which can be piped to different systems and used to link into automated detections and things like that, which is super powerful. But obviously, as you touched on, requires a bit more technical maturity to make the most of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So that's probably the real challenge with integrating with a threat sharing community like that is, yes, you can just download a dump of from the fire hose of all the indicators and advisories and things like that. But what do you actually do with it at that point? How do you operationalize that sort of information, put it in your systems, have your threat intel analysts, or these days AI and LLM look across that data set and make decisions that impact your organization and mitigate risk? So that's where we've seen typically a lot of organizations struggle. And something I'm really interested in is how can we help those organizations to operationalize the technology, build those detection rules, do those API integrations into their systems to be able to automate and orchestrate, because there's so much information coming down now. It's nearly impossible for a human analyst to just be across everything that's going in with an organization. So leveraging the technologies and the capabilities available can really make your life a lot easier for the CTI program and cut the costs significantly.
Let's say that someone listening to this is feeling inspired to go out and get involved in a threat sharing community. What's one small next step they could take after listening to this podcast to make the first step toward that?
Look, I think it's really a lot of internal reflection about what do I really need from a threat sharing platform or a threat sharing group that you want to sign up for. I think going just randomly approaching groups to get a feed of information, it could be beneficial in some ways, but be really targeted about what you want out of the program. What are your requirements? How does that map to your organizational risks? Because if you get a better understanding of what you need, you can get a better value from that particular group.
Well, thanks, Prescott. This has been a really interesting conversation. If anyone's interested in chatting to you or someone else at Cosive for help with threat sharing related stuff or getting involved with CTIS and that sort of thing, you can reach out to us over email at hello@cosive.com, and we'd love to have a chat with you and learn more about what you're thinking of doing. But with that, thanks, Prescott.
Thanks so much, Tash. Great to talk.